Hi. Thank you so much for coming. I want to welcome you to the 13th annual Robert Fitch Memorial Lecture. My name is Karen Miller. I'm a professor here in the Social Science Department, and I've been organizing this lecture since its inception. This event is also being live streamed by Boston Review, and we're really grateful for them putting it up on the web, so thank you, and hello everyone out there. Thank you to everyone who came to what promises to be an excellent talk, one that honors Bob Fitch's legacy by connecting some of his ideas to questions about Palestine, solidarity, and working class democracy. I am so honored that Robin D.G. Kelley, who I first met in 1992 when I was a fifth-year undergrad at the University of Michigan, agreed to be our speaker this year. Robin joins what has become a long line of inspiring scholars and thinkers who've given this talk, and they include Doug Henwood, who I'm about to introduce, John Halley, Ruth Wilson Gilmore, Sharon Zukin, Peter Kwong, Peter Marcuse, Kianka Yamada-Taylor, Richard Walker, Terry Hum, Suketu Meha, Kim Phillips-Fine, and Cindy Katz. After this talk, please join us for a name reading memorializing those who have been killed by the Israeli siege and bombardment of Gaza, organized by the Faculty and Staff for Justice in Palestine at CUNY. This vigil will begin at 2:15. It will be held in the E Atrium, which is on the first floor, just outside of our library, and people will be walking there. Doug Henwood will do the honors of talking more about Bob and introducing Robin, but I'm going to tell you who he is. Doug is a Brooklyn-based journalist and broadcaster who specializes in economics and politics. He published The Left Business Observer from 1986 to 2013. He's the host of Behind the News, a fantastic weekly radio show, which I highly recommend, that originates at KPFA in Berkeley and is syndicated across the country and the web presence across the world. His work has appeared in Harper's, Jacobin, Book Forum, Grand Street, and The Nation, where he's also a contributing editor, among other publications. And his books include Wall Street, How It Works and For Whom, still really great, from the late 90s, After the New Economy, an analysis of the boom and bust of the 90s, and My Turn, Hillary Clinton Targets the Presidency. He is currently working on a book about the American ruling class. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen, and thanks for all the organizing work you and your colleagues do for this. It's become a regular event in my spring calendar. Welcome to the 13th annual Robert Fitch Memorial Lecture. I hope that number doesn't trigger anyone suffering from triskaidekaphobia. As I've said every year introducing these, when I gave the first Fitch lecture in 2012, I was worried there wouldn't be a second. I never could have imagined there would be a dozen more, and featuring so many distinguished speakers. We feel very honored that Robin Kelley is doing today's. Bob taught at LaGuardia from 1993 until his death in 2011. He is deeply devoted to the college and his students here, and there is no better place to honor him. A few words about Bob. I met him in the late 80s when we were both writing for the Village Voice. He'd just come out of hiding. A few years earlier, a publisher gave him an advance for a book he never wrote, and the publisher wanted the money back. Bob never had any money to speak of, so that advance was long gone, and of course he couldn't repay it. Just after meeting him, I read his essay, Planning New York, a look at the 1929 master scheme by the Regional Plan Association. I'd lived in New York for about a decade by then. I still didn't really get how the place was run. After reading Bob's essay, I began to. By Bob's telling, the RPA's plan laid out a vision of the metropolitan area with Manhattan as an office hub and a network of highways moving people in and out of the city and the suburbs. That's pretty much what had happened in the ensuing decades. More recent plans by the RPA, the city, and the real estate industry have extended the development of Manhattan out to downtown Brooklyn and to this neighborhood, Long Island City. The high-rises that have sprouted in this once low-rise neighborhood are the visible fruits of those plans. But now, with so many office buildings empty and unlikely ever to be filled to capacity anytime soon, the planning apparatus has a problem. There's talk of converting them to apartments, but progress, if that's what you want to call it, has been slow. Will it happen? Will it work? Sad to say, there are a few people writing critically on these matters with the insight that Bob brought to them. Bob's analysis of New York City is exemplified by his 1996 book, The Assassination of New York, whose cover picture depicts David Rockefeller driving a bulldozer, flattening the buildings whose profit potential didn't please him. But that's not all Bob wrote about. He is a real politician. He wrote a book about Ghana in the late 1960s. He studied Chinese language and literature. He wrote very critically about the miserable ossification of American unions, a critique that didn't win him many friends. And he was an extremely warm and generous person. I miss him terribly as a friend and as a thinker. Much of our friendship was conducted in long phone conversations about the miserable state of things. Sad to say they were mostly miserable, alas. I wish I could hear his analysis of Eric Adams, the cop and austerity mayor, but who, despite his love of law enforcement, seems to keep some shady company. At a time when the city could use some energetic leadership, given the slowness of our recovery from the COVID shock, we have a vain demagogue who wants to blame desperate migrants for our troubles instead. With the New York Post whipping up invented tales of a crime wave, amplified by Donald Trump, who bellowed at his Truth Social platform a few months ago, "Murders and violent crime hit unimaginable records," all in caps with an exclamation point to top it off, in the city, we could use a mayor who could calm things down with a little truth-telling, but that's not the Adams style. Just to set the record straight, let's look at murders. These are the best measure to look at according to criminal justice connoisseurs. Murder isn't only the most serious crime around, the stats on them are the most reliable because other types are subject to reporting and classification errors. Last year, there were 391 murders, down 11% from 2022, 20% from 2021, and 83% from the all-time high in 1990. So far this year, murders are down 25% from the same period last year. If that rate is sustained through 2024, we'll be back to pre-COVID rates of murder. There is no crime wave, but reactionaries like Trump and Adams want you to think so. You can almost understand Trump's motivation. He wants to ride fear into a second term, a terrifying concept, and to distract attention from his troubles with the prosecutor he mysteriously calls Peekaboo James. But Adams has no excuse, so I guess it's easier for the cops and landlords mayor to give into a manufactured panic than it is to talk about the cost of housing or adapting to climate change. On those things, at least Bill de Blasio could talk a good games. Adams can't even do that. Better to stoke fears of our neighbors and of refugees. Enough local news. It's time to introduce today's speaker, Robin D.G. Kelley, Distinguished Professor and Gary B. Nash Endowed Chair in U.S. History at UCLA. Among his books are Hammer and Hoe, Alabama Communists During the Great Depression, Freedom Dreams, The Black Radical Imagination, and Thelonious Monk, The Life and Times of an American Original. I read some of Robin's recent writing on Palestine and was very interested in his history of how black intellectuals and activists in the US supported the founding of Israel at first, seeing it as a homeland for people who've been persecuted for centuries, but then that view evolved into seeing it as the settler colonial state of a sort they were all too familiar with at home. That began a long history of solidarity between Palestinians and black Americans, with the solidarity running in both directions, reinforced over the last decade with Israel's repeated assaults on Gaza and rising protests in the US against police murders of black people. I'm told that Robin Kelley will draw on Bob Fitch's critique of the labor left's focus on union democracy at the expense of working class democracy, a system of representation that offers workers a choice of political ends and promotes solidarity. From that, Robin will discuss divisions in the US labor movement over Palestine, though we've never seen anything like the UAW's recent endorsement of a ceasefire. I say I'm told because you never know what a speaker will say until they say it. Looking forward to hearing more. Robin Kelley.
Okay, good afternoon. I just got off a red eye from LA. I was just in Hawaii before that. I had about 5 hours between flights. So I'm tired. but I will do the best I can. This is so great. This is so important. And I'm very nervous because this is a very important lecture. And this lecture, this talk, which, by the way, is about 35 minutes, and just notice the time. It is 1:18. So if I go to 2 o'clock, don't be mad at me, right? Because I do want to have some time for Q&A. But it's very important because what I'm going to talk about really is thinking with Bob Fitch, who I knew a little bit, met a few times here in New York in those days. But before I do that, let me just first of all thank my dear friend Karen Miller, who I've known many, many years, for the impromptu invitation, I think it was on a plane, for the students and the faculty and staff at LaGuardia Community College who kind of put this together, and especially Doug Henwood, whose work I've been reading for many, many years and I keep learning from. And of course, for my friends who came out this afternoon. So I want to honor Bob by talking about what I think he would be talking about in the situation in Palestine, and more importantly, how he might be thinking about the genocide in ways that would be attentive to political economy and history. I mean, it's things that he was really, really careful about. Now, I don't have a clue what he would say. In fact, I don't have a clue what I would say. And even if I did know what he'd say, I wouldn't want to repeat it. However, I do think there are lessons that could be drawn out from his work by looking at Palestine and Palestinian solidarity through a labor or working class lens. And of course, I just want to open up by saying, by sort of acknowledging the UAW making history by being the largest union in the country to call for a ceasefire. And I think that's very, very important. Of course, new leadership under Shawn Fain is pretty spectacular. I was rooting for him when he was running for the position. And of course, we should ask the harder question, where was labor overall in 2006 and 2008 and 2012 and 2014 and 2019 and 2021? In fact, especially 2021, because on May 18th, 2021, Palestinian workers inside 48 borders, inside Israel and inside the West Bank and East Jerusalem and Gaza, organized a day-long general strike to protest the assault on Palestinians in Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood at the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and also to protest the siege in Gaza. They called it a dignity strike. Mostly workers in construction, sanitation, hotel and restaurant workers, transportation like taxi and bus drivers, and hundreds of workers were fired for participating in that general strike in 2021. So imagine if US labor unions had come out in solidarity with that general strike in May 18, 2021, how the landscape would look different. Of course, you didn't have a Shawn Fain in those days. All things considered, the UAW's new leadership was ahead and is ahead of most US labor leaders. Even the AFL-CIO, which opposed any statement in support of ceasefire, quite recently kind of came around. And of course, there are always the left-led unions that launched the National Labor Network for Ceasefire, headed by the usual suspects. National Nurses United, which is one of the greatest unions on the planet, the American Postal Workers Union, the Association of Flight Attendants, the Chicago Teachers Union, the International Union of Trades, the National Educational Association, International Longshore, and of course UE, United Electrical Workers. So in this case, a ceasefire is the minimum. Palestinian labor unions had actually issued a statement on October 16th calling for more than a ceasefire. They called for organized labor to literally stop the flow of weapons to Israel by any means at their disposal. They specifically asked workers to refuse to manufacture weapons earmarked for Israel, to refuse to transport weapons to Israel, to take action against firms complicit in the siege on Gaza, and to press their governments to end military and financial support for Israel. So ceasefire is minimum. But even Shawn Fain's position, was compromised in some ways after he endorsed President Biden who bears much of the responsibility for the ongoing genocide. And I understand why, but we all know that airdropping 38,000 single meal packs to 500,000 Gazans on the brink of famine, as children literally die of starvation and dehydration, is a kind of cruel performance. We also know that Biden can easily change the situation by simply cutting off the supply of US weapons. But instead, he sends more arms through secret back channels, while Congress votes to send Israel a whopping $14 billion to finish the job. Biden's obligation, in accordance with ICJ's finding of plausible risk of genocide, is to act decisively to stop genocide. That's international law. Finds endorsement of Biden for some rank and file members, particularly those who represent Michigan's Arab American community, was seen as a slap in the face. And that's why you have so many working class voters voting uncommitted. Which brings me back to Bob Fitch. In a talk he gave in 2010, he argued that the labor left should focus less on union democracy and instead fight for what he's calling working class democracy. The genuine left, he argued, seeks not to democratize the machines from within, but to defeat them by extending the scope of conflict. And this is, Bob speaking, breaking down local boundaries, nationalizing, and even internationalizing class action and union representation. And he goes on to say, quote, the first step in the transformation of American unionism in the 21st century is to get beyond exclusion. A labor left that breaks with the old playbook will bypass the autonomous local union. It will fight to end monopoly unionism, creating a system of representation that offers workers a choice of political ends, transforming, finally, a culture that breeds sectionalism into one that promotes solidarity. So, what does this mean for Palestine? First of all, internationalizing class action means recognizing the people of Gaza and the West Bank and East Jerusalem as part of a class, an especially exploited, oppressed, and vulnerable segment of the global working class. There is no way that stopping genocide and demanding justice for Palestinians should divide the class, right? And there's nothing democratic about union leaders speaking for the class, investing its dues in supporting actions that contribute to the subjugation of Palestinian workers, or setting labor's international political agenda. As a consequence, union leadership has essentially foreclosed avenues of solidarity with Palestinian workers despite pressure from below. And there are too many examples to cite, but I suggest checking out Jeff Shorkey's excellent writing on the subject in Jacobin. But I do recall in my lifetime, in fact, living here in New York, the shameful position taken by national union leaders in the aftermath of 9/11 during the Second Intifada. And in 2002, Israel destroyed the offices of the Palestinian General Federation of Trade Unions in Nablus. And US labor leaders, were basically silent. One exception, of course, was the San Francisco Labor Council, which passed a resolution condemning Israel for, quote, the bombing of civilian and political targets and upholding Palestinians' right to self-determination in the resolution. But Zionists within the AFL-CIO pressured the council to rescind the resolution. And this was during the era of labor's, quote-unquote, left turn, when the triumvirate of John Sweeney, Richard Trumka, Linda Chavez Thompson had taken over the AFL-CIO. Sweeney especially was out of step with a growing rank and file increasingly critical of Israel. He addressed the National Rally for Israel in Washington, D.C. just a month after the San Francisco Labor Council had passed that resolution. And here's Sweeney on the steps near the Capitol joining Netanyahu, joining Rudy Giuliani in declaring that, quote, working women and men of the AFL-CIO stand with you to express our support for the people of Israel in the darkest hours. Angry rank and file members responded swiftly with a petition condemning Sweeney, Israel's invasion of the West Bank in the name of labor. So my basic contention is that had the labor left developed the kind of boundless, borderless worker democracy, working class democracy that Bob Fitch proposed, the political landscape with respect to US policy toward Israel might look very different today. Indeed, it would probably more closely resemble organized labor's position vis-a-vis apartheid in South Africa in the 1980s. In fact, I would say resemble much of the working class organizing around the world outside the United States. And this is the time when boycott was considered a legitimate, non-violent tactic and not a malicious act of anti-Semitism. This is when dock workers, which they still do, use their power to refuse to unload cargo headed to Durban. Imagine how working class democracy, working class power, and internationalism might have inspired a general strike in solidarity calling for an end to genocide. Why not a general strike to end genocide? Why not? But to understand the obstacles to this scenario requires some explaining. And for those of you who may know this history, forgive me, I'm not assuming that you know this history, because some people don't. But part of the issue is that for much of its history, Israel was regarded as a kind of worker state. And Zionism was associated with the Labor Party, the ruling party, the Mapai Party. And some equated Zionism with socialism. Initially, labor Zionists were in fact the minority, especially in the early 20th century. We could talk about that, but Zionism grew in popularity during the rise of Nazism and the Holocaust. And for survivors of the Shoah, Israel became a safe haven for Jewish resettlement and a vehicle through which Germany could pay reparations. Labor Zionists looked to Palestine as a potential socialist promised land. So therefore, it's no surprise that US labor unions gave millions of dollars to support Israel. They bought Israeli bonds. They donated money to Zionist labor organizations, specifically the Histadrut. In fact, labor and the international communist movement's support for Zionism obscures Israel's formation as a settler colonial state. Now, I'm guessing you probably know what happened next, but it bears repeating. So Zionists accepted the UN partition plan in 1947, dividing Palestine into Jewish and Arab states, with the former receiving 56% of the land, in theory, and Palestinians getting the other 44%. Of course, the Arab population did not agree to this settlement. Palestinians argued that the partition was illegal, and in fact requested that the matter be referred to the International Court of Justice for an advisory opinion, but pressure from the US blocked it. Now, publicly, the Mapai Party, the Labor Party, accepted the terms of the partition, but then waged a war to expel Palestinians and seize additional territory. It was a plan. Under David Ben-Gurion's leadership, Israeli militias, the Haganah, Irgun, the Stern Gang, the Palmach, waged a deliberate campaign to terrorize, kill, or injure and dispossess Palestinians, raze their villages, take or destroy their property, and above all, take the land. So from December 1947 to July 1949, Zionist militias drove 750,000 people off of the land, 80% of the Palestinian population, destroyed or emptied 500 villages, demolished homes, sometimes setting them ablaze or blowing them up, knowing that there were families inside. Men were lined up and shot, women killed, children shot. Wholesale massacres in the villages of Deir Yassin and Tantura are etched in Palestinian collective memory. In Haifa, the militias rolled barrels of explosives and large steel balls into Palestinian neighborhoods, followed by a generous stream of oil and gasoline, which they then set alight. David Ben-Gurion used fear to mobilize Jewish support in world opinion by making public statements comparing Arabs to Nazis and warning of a second Holocaust. In private, he used language similar to that of colonial officers preparing for a campaign. And this is from a man who fashioned himself, he called himself a Zionist Lenin, okay? Not, the other Lenin, just so you know. And he wrote in his diary in January 1st, 1948, quote, "There is a need now for strong and brutal reaction. We need to be accurate about timing, place, and those we hit. If we accuse a family, we need to harm them without mercy, women and children included. Otherwise, this is not an effective reaction. During the operation, there is no need to distinguish between guilty and not guilty." Okay, so by the armistice of 1949, the state of Israel occupied 78%, not the 56% allotted, of Palestine, and passed laws denying those expelled the right to return or to retrieve their property. The 160,000 Palestinians remaining within Israel's borders were placed under military administration until 1966. Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon ultimately and reluctantly absorbed tens of thousands of Nakba survivors, though the responsibility for providing food, shelter, education, and initially jobs, that's another story, and other necessities fell on the UN Relief and Works agencies, UNRWA. Now, the UN bears some responsibility for the Nakba and the absence of accountability because, similar to the League of Nations, the UN never declared, at least that's in the early stages, declared colonialism a crime against humanity. Gandhi, W.B. Du Bois, member states like Haiti tried but failed. Why? One, in 1945, the UN made a distinction between civilized nations and the rest. Secondly, the UN was designed to recognize nations and not peoples. Only nations had rights. Therefore, an attack on colonialism was interpreted as an assault on the sovereignty of colonizing nations. And Du Bois put it clearly in his book, The World in Africa, when he wrote, quote, "There will be at least 750 million colored and black folk inhabiting colonies owned by white nations who will have no rights that the white people of the world are bound to respect. Revolt on their part can be put down by military force. They will have no right of appeal to the council or the assembly. They will have no standing before the International Court of Justice." And that was the context for the Nakba. In any case, the birth of Israel was widely celebrated in left and labor circles, including by people like Paul Robeson, not just in the US, but again, around the world. And it was bizarrely seen as a war of national liberation against the British and Arab armies. And note, we don't always talk about this, but Israel got its weapons from where? Soviet Union, Czechoslovakia, and of course the Communist Party backed Zionism. Even as Israel continued to dispossess Palestinians in Gaza, for example, in 1956, there were at least 2 massacres, and Israel actually tried to hold Gaza at that point and couldn't, but ended up getting it in 1967. It nevertheless portrayed itself as a friend of the Third World, a friend of the non-aligned movement, and offered aid to African nations, especially military aid. But then this changes in 1967, after the Arab-Israeli War, or what Palestinians call the Naksa, or setback. So Israel represented itself as the David against the Goliath of Egypt, Syria, and the Arab nations, but that self-representation did not persuade a new generation of leftists, including anti-Zionist Jews and black radicals, who regarded Israel's occupation of the West Bank, East Jerusalem, Gaza, the Golan Heights, as further proof that Zionism was a form of settler colonialism akin to American racism and South African apartheid. So in Detroit, for example, where black students and black workers were were closely aligned, we see more strident examples of solidarity with Palestine. In fact, in the months after the war in 1967, the Arab Student Organization, as well as the staff of the Inner City Voice, which is a left black publication, members of SNCC, and members of People Against Racism, picketed a speech by Abba Eban, Israel's representative in the UN. And in that protest, it called Israel a racist state that, quote, practices apartheid far more ruthlessly than the Union of South Africa. This is 1967. That Eban was actually from South Africa prompted many of the protesters to draw direct links between the two countries. In fact, they held signs that read, Israel used napalm on Arabs, why? Or another sign that read, South Africa and Israel, both race supremacists. John Watson, who was one of the founders of the League of Revolutionary Black Workers and editor of the South End at Wayne State University, which is a student paper that Watson and his comrades just took over and made it into a radical community labor publication, ran articles supporting the PLO as early as 1969. And the League and the Dodge Revolutionary Union movement, DRUM, also organized Arab American auto workers and printed some of the leaflets in Arabic. In 1973, time of the Yom Kippur War, Arab workers accounted for about 2,000 of the 35,000 workers at the Ford Rouge plant in Dearborn. And the union was, there was predominantly black. It was Local 600, very famous union. And in fact, UAW's largest local. So when word got out that the local had purchased $300,000 in Israeli bonds without approval from the rank and file, again, this is a predominantly black union. The UAW, as a whole, by the way, bought like 750,000 bonds across the country. But Arab workers mobilized against Local 600 leadership and led a mass march in October 1973 from the streets of South End, which is largely Arab American community in Dearborn, to the offices of Local 600. And there they protested UAW purchase of these Israeli bonds, and in fact challenged black leaders, asking them, how would you feel if the UAW bought like South African bonds, for example? And it really kind of disrupted the politics within the UAW then. And in fact, November 28th, this is like a month and a half later, Leonard Woodcock, was leader of Local 600, was being presented a humanitarian award from B'nai B'rith at this dinner. And 2,000, mostly Arab workers, demonstrated outside of the dinner. And some of them had actually waged a wildcat strike at the Dodge main plant earlier that afternoon, which of course pissed off UAW leadership, who denounced the protests as communist-inspired. So you could see, underneath the surface, bubbling up, is this pro-Palestinian position. But 1967 is important for other reasons, which I think we can draw from by reading Bob Fitch's work on Ghana. So let me just take a little detour here. So I think Bob Fitch's core ideas about working class democracy grow partly out of his research on Ghana's independence movement, which was published in 1966. So he was at UC Berkeley doing a master's degree in history, and he was working on a thesis, which he completed in '66, titled Opposition Movements in Ghana, 1954 to 1958. And so what he did was he sent 3 chapters of the thesis to Monthly Review and to see if they're interested in a book. And of course, Paul Sweezy, Paul Baran, they were like the major figures behind Monthly Review Press. They received the thesis, or parts of it, like literally days before the coup that overthrew Kwame Nkrumah. So the timing was perfect. Like that's the best time to submit a book manuscript. And so Paul Sweezy and Paul Baran, they were like, this is great. And they wrote him, they said, drop everything else and bring the story up to date, and we're gonna publish it in the summer issue of Monthly Review. And so he recruited Mary Oppenheimer, who's also a fellow graduate student, and together they wrote this book, published in '66, called Ghana, End of an Illusion. Now, I'm not going to repeat the full argument here, but see, they were interested in understanding why Nkrumah, then considered by the left as a visionary, and by the right as a megalomaniac whose radical delusions drove Ghana's economy into the ground, was overthrown, but not just overthrown by the CIA, we know that part, but overthrown with basically no opposition. In other words, it was a popular support for his ouster. And so they reject the easy arguments that blame his personality or the machinations of the CIA, and instead place the coup within a broader international framework. They place it within the context of Algeria's counter-revolution, the counter-revolution in Nigeria, Brazil, Indonesia, Congo, and I would add Dominican Republic. So Fitch and Oppenheimer offer an elaborate analysis of the political economy, class forces, et cetera, but the key in the piece to Nkrumah's defeat is the suppression of working class democracy, the energies of the masses in motion. And they note how in 1949-50, Nkrumah kind of rode the mass rebellion until they called a general strike, and then he suddenly, distanced himself from the working class. And Fitch and Oppenheimer called this moment, quote, the nadir of the Gold Coast independence movement. So the first 4 years, Ghana took the course of kind of neocolonial development. Then in 1961, after the overthrow of Patrice Lumumba in the Congo, Nkrumah announced a turn towards socialism, and he established ties with the Soviet Union. Meanwhile, as he's making this shift, the conditions of workers in Ghana just are deteriorating. So they organized a general strike, which Nkrumah crushed. He arrested the leaders of the strike, and just undermined labor's democracy. And I think Fitch and Oppenheimer make this really important observation. They write, the Convention of People's Party's government, this is Nkrumah's government, rationalized its police measures against the organized working class by equating independence with socialism. They're not the same thing. So the book closes with an argument for revolutionary warfare against neocolonial elites and colonial forces. Now, in their conclusion, what is to be done, it's written in 1966, so it's kind of romantic. It reflects the era's Marxist dedication to growth and industrialization, which actually, when you read Walter Rodney's How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, it's the same argument. There's this kind of fascination with growth and industrialization. Nevertheless, they conclude that the experience of guerrilla war, not the violence per se, but the experience prepares the masses to seize the future. And they write, peasants, proletarians, and revolutionary intellectuals develop into a homogeneous, disciplined force, learning at the same time the technical skills and the inventiveness needed for industrialization. And then they continue, if, as the evidence of recent history suggests, this is the road forward for the exploited colonial and neocolonial peoples of the world, then it will be in the forests, in the savannas, where the roads turn into paths and the sun beats down on thatch roof shacks, that Ghana's working classes will join together to prepare the future, okay? So now this excursion into Ghana, into the Ghana book, is more than a detour. I would argue that the Arab-Israeli War in '67 reflects this counter-revolutionary trend and the revolutionary hope that they're talking about in a different way. The PLO was that guerrilla army, right, that they described, that they imagined, but there was no revolution. If anything, Fatah became Israel's police force after the Oslo Accords. The problem with Palestine comes back then to Fitch's insistence on what? Working class democracy. Labor had little or no say in the leadership and direction of the liberation struggle. Frantz Fanon made this point. And so accident, the first epigraph in the book is from Fanon. So there was a trade union movement in Palestine before the Nakba. The Society of Arab Workers. Some Arab workers were organized by the Communist Party of Palestine, the Federation of Arab Trade Unions and Labor Societies, Arab Workers Congress, so forth. In 1948, Israel banned the Arab Workers Congress. In 1952, Palestinian workers were allowed to join the Zionist Histadrut, but many of them were actually excluded from membership, denied work, and few Arab workers were even allowed to stay in the Histadrut. Those who were allowed to stay couldn't vote in the union elections until 1965. So basically, organized labor in Palestine was kind of forced underground during the Israeli occupation. Union leaders were harassed, jailed, deported throughout the 1970s, and yet unions grew nonetheless. And in the late 70s, there were some 12,000 Palestinians who claimed union membership, in part because they were working inside of Israel. They were crossing the Green Line. And in some ways, that labor, kind of drove organization, but they were also appendages of the liberation movement, which also reflected the kind of factional divides. So for example, there's some unions that are identified with the PLO and the PFLP, the Popular Front for Liberation of Palestine, and there's another faction of unions that identified with the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine. So they were organized less along lines of occupation and more along lines of politics. And then of course, when the General Trade Union Federation was formed, the political division still prevailed. Either way, unions were subordinated to the liberation movement. Labor leaders agreed, arguing that the class struggle had to take a backseat to ending the occupation. But there were extraordinary moments of general strikes. For example, Land Day, which we know today kind of as the March of Return, but Land Day was a general strike on March 30th, 1976, organized across Palestine to protest the Galilee Development Plan, which would have created Jewish settlements out of confiscated land that was owned by Palestinians. And there's subsequent to Land Day strikes, it was very bloody, as we've seen with the March of Return. Now, it's axiomatic almost to claim that Israeli settlers wanted nothing more than to eliminate the indigenous population. However, like I said, Palestinians crossed the Green Line to work. And when they did, Israel imposed a workers' tax plus welfare deductions on their checks, plus Histadrut collected 1% of their pay as dues, but did nothing to address their low wages, poor health and safety standards, or provide services. Even as their leaders complained that Palestinians from the occupied territories were undermining employment opportunities for Israeli nationals. So the Palestine General Federation of Trade Unions estimated that the Histadrut pocketed something like 400 million shekels, or about $110 million out of the 1% dues, which they never paid back to Palestinians. This is between 1970 and 1994. At the time of the Oslo Accords, Israel continued to exploit Palestinian labor in both the West Bank and Gaza. And in Gaza, tens of thousands of Palestinian workers gathered at the Eretz checkpoint in what really was called a modern slave market to take construction jobs. They'd get up at 3 o'clock in the morning and take these construction jobs inside of Israel and come back. Wages were on average 1/3 less than the prevailing wages for Jewish workers in the same industry. But pay, as paltry as it was, still nevertheless made up 30% of Gaza's GNP. And then the number started to shrink. Before the Gulf War, about 180,000 Palestinians from the occupied territories worked in Israel, about 80,000 from Gaza. After the war, about 100,000, with 35,000 from Gaza. By 1995, about 45,000 Palestinian workers from the occupied territories, with 16,000 coming in from Gaza. And this is due in large part due to Rabin's separation policy. And of course, how did they make up for the shortfall? Well, we know. They began importing workers from Southeast Asia, right? 59,000 workers from Southeast Asia and Eastern Europe. Once the Palestinian Authority assumed governing responsibilities in 1994, the cost of living went up 25%, unemployment in Gaza rose 50%, and the Palestinian Authority's basically subordination of unions, right, which is the absence of working class democracy, kind of explains why unions were so weak in post-Oslo Palestine. So just a couple of final things. Leftists within the labor movement, like Hassan Barghouti of the Democracy and Workers' Rights Center in Ramallah, hoped that Palestinian workers would lead a broad democratic coalition made up of Palestinian civil society organizations, women's groups, and Palestinian political factions. And in 1995, he observed, which is really a parallel to Bob Fitch's vision of the working class democracy, he said, our struggle is not going to be confined solely to economic issues. It will also include law, democracy, human rights, social provision, and education, in short, development. The next stage requires a new kind of struggle in which workers should take a main responsibility for the welfare of the Palestinian nation. Of course, that didn't happen for various reasons. And in fact, I'm going to skip over this, but the Palestinian Authority actually played a role in kind of undermining independent labor organizing. So, for example, there's no social contract, no minimum wage laws, wages were not tied to cost of living, and no right to strike. So when teachers went on strike in 1997, independent of the PGFTU, and they were just looking for, they were making like $300 a month, and they're trying to double their salary. The Ministry of Education offered 10% increase, so they struck. And what did the state do? I mean, when I say the state, the kind of fake state of the Palestinian Authority, the Minister of Education suspended 19 members without salary. Arafat himself had 15 members of the strike committee in Jericho jailed, okay? And while all this is happening, by the way, something we don't talk about, there was a kind of neoliberal move to create industrial zones, right? Enterprise zones, modeled off of Taiwan and off the maquiladoras in Mexico that were adjacent to Gaza. For example, they were used to attract Israeli and Palestinian foreign capital. They had food processing, textiles, furniture making inside of Gaza, but on the border of Israel. Israel was the sole recipient of tax revenue. US investors got tax breaks, but firms would be located, again, inside Gaza, which saved money in terms of not investing in heavy security infrastructure. And these zones, of course, were demolished in 2004 with the withdrawal of settlers. But the idea is not dead. In 2021, there are plans afoot, although now they're probably scuttled, to create these new industrial zones in Gaza on the ruins of the old. And if you pay attention to like these free trade agreements between Israel and Jordan, Israel and UAE, they're all building these industrial zones to exploit Palestinian labor. So don't tell me that no one wants Palestinian labor. You know, they want them under the conditions of the maquiladoras, right? In any case, in closing, clearly Israel is not, nor has ever been, the worker state that labor Zionists dreamed it would be. It is a settler colonial state built on dispossession and military occupation, and it is clearly a part of the global capitalist system. Bob Fitch understood the class struggle. He knew from his work on Ghana that crushing working class democracy arrests class struggle, or at least weakens working class power. He asked us to imagine the working class not as an interest group, not as a sector, but as a movement, the movement, to recognize that a genuine working class democracy is not constrained by nation, and to also recognize that, you know, you can't have a working class democracy that oversees an ethno-state. That's impossible. Working class democracy is what the Communist International was supposed to be, and what some dreamers thought the UN could be if it had declared colonialism a crime against humanity and recognized peoples, the proletariat, rather than nation states. It's kind of like that song penned by Eugene Potier in 1871, the French anarchist, poet, and transport worker, and wrote the song during the Paris Commune, the song that can never fit comfortably over the melody of La Marseillaise, since the national anthem never made good internationalist music. The song whose melody was composed by the Belgian socialist Pierre de Guyter and first performed in the summer of 1888, 5 years after Marx's death. It is that song, dedicated to working class democracy, to the inexorable rise of the wretched of the earth, the promise of a free world, the promise that a better world's in birth. Free the land, free Palestine. Thank you. Thank you.